Right, so we've seen now that there's evidence for the earliest of us, of our species, Homo sapiens, emerging in Africa. And it looks like they hung around there for quite some time. There is a perplexing thing about the evidence that as it exists. We saw Colin Renfrew in an earlier chapter, chapter 2, about where I said he was a processualist and that sort of thing. He asked a very intriguing question a number of years ago that he framed by creating a term which he calls the cognitive paradox. That he says, in sort of ungracious terms, he says, if all the hardware was there 200,000 years ago, he said, why did it take so long for something interesting to happen? That's 100,000 years, right? So 200,000 years, and the first form of artwork that we see, the first real pushing of and using our brains for something a little bit challenging, is at the earliest 100,000 years later. So half of the time we're around, we're not doing very much with it. Now, he calls it the sapient paradox because it's a paradox. I don't have an answer to that question. But I do want you to think about that. It's like, what were the pressures? What could possibly have been driving humans to use their imagination to try and make the world a little bit different for them? We don't have clear answers. But even though the first inklings, the first assemblages of these artistic works, these imaginative works, using the full capacity of what our brains allow us to think and do, start to appear in Africa, it's when humans start to move out and find new challenges that really comes into its own, that our imagination really becomes an advantage. So one of the first places, as you might imagine, as humans in Africa, a similar sort of a population expansion took place that we saw earlier with Homo erectus, where Homo erectus emerged in Africa and spread out throughout the entirety of the Old World. The same thing happens with that branch of the Homo erectus species that stayed in Africa. Created out of that was created the Homo sapiens species, and then that species emerged and left Africa. Some stayed in Africa, but some left, and when they left, they encountered relic, archaic humans, either Homo erectus or Neanderthal, or in Siberia, probably a couple different branches of Denisovans. Humans encountered that earlier migration of Homo erectus. There's some other ones as well that existed in Java that humans might have encountered. The island of Flores in Indonesia, called Homo floresiensis, that is what we call them, sort of seem to go back. They became smaller, probably a bit of island dwarfism, but their brains became smaller too, even proportionally. So they probably found that their survivability wasn't so related to their intelligence, and so they started to become a different species altogether. But the first place that they encountered some of these relic Homo erectus was, of course, the first place that you would stop when you're leaving Africa, and that's the Middle East. So we do have a fair bit of information we talked about a little bit about this in the Middle East with Neanderthals. But alongside those Neanderthal sites, we also have an intersection of Homo sapiens coming out of Africa and bumping into these Neanderthals that were living there as well. So we saw already that Neanderthals were in places like Shanidar Cave and Amud Cave in Israel, and then Kafsa Cave and School Cave in Israel. We find modern humans dating to about 120 to 80,000 years ago. So it looks like Neanderthals and modern humans were overlapping and coexisting in the same area. What were they doing? Well, it's kind of hard to tell, but because we can't go back in time to ask them or to see them. But there was some mixing of cultural and artifactual traces that we find. So both modern humans and Neanderthals made stone tools using the Levallois technique that we looked at last chapter. In the Middle East, neither humans nor Neanderthals, or Homo sapiens nor Neanderthals, neither of them seem to have used bone tools to any great extent, and none of them had particularly a lot of art. They did seem to, both groups tended to bury their dead in pits, but they didn't have very many grave goods. They had small sites, but they both used fire. It looks like they overlapped in time, and it's sometimes hard to tell apart one site that was human and one that was Neanderthal. So we can ask ourselves some questions at this point about how did this all happen? Why didn't Neanderthals evolve into us? Why aren't we the product of Neanderthals? Well, it seems to have been a parallel evolution that was taking place in Africa, and we just seem to be Africans. All Homo sapiens seem to have been emerging from Africa at a fairly recent date, probably as late as 120,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago. And certainly they didn't go into Europe before the Upper Paleolithic in Europe about 60,000 years ago. So they were really arriving into a region that had been lived in by Neanderthals for quite some time during the Ice Ages. So Neanderthals seem to have been extinct have just disappeared from the Middle East by about 40,000 years ago, and in Europe they hung on a little bit longer. By about 27,000 years ago we see really no more traces of them. But during that time we see waves of Homo sapiens start to come into this area. So there are three main hypotheses about how what happened to Neanderthals and how we interacted with them. One of them is the out of Africa hypothesis, which is the replacement hypothesis, that basically Neanderthals had their run, they died out, they evolved in parallel to the African modern anatomically modern humans and behaviorally modern humans. And they just died out and were replaced by modern humans in especially Europe about 40 to 30,000 years ago. There's another model, which is hybridization, that modern humans came into Europe from Africa and bred with Neanderthals, and that Neanderthals didn't really go extinct, but their traits became hybridized and sort of tamped down, and their traits were bred out. That the larger group was the modern humans, and Neanderthals at this point were basically absorbed by the human population. And there's a third theory that Neanderthals were not actually even a separate species, and that there was constant gene flow between these groups, and that Neanderthals were actually just a subset of modern humans. That seems to be unlikely because I've talked to you already about this, that genetically speaking, Neanderthals are separate. They're close enough to us that we could actually breed with them. That was possible, but not so close that we are identical, and we can see different genetic markers that are significant. So it seems as though either the replacement hypothesis, that humans moved in and just wiped out the Neanderthals, or that a big group of humans moved in and absorbed Neanderthals, seems to be the more likely scenarios. So you can see these a little bit more explained in a graph on figure 5.8. There seems to be support for a strong sense of out of Africa theory, that later Neanderthals don't show modern human traits, and so it doesn't support a multi-regional theory. And this is Saint Césaire from France, about 36,000 years old, is one example of this. But there are also persistent Neanderthal traits between Neanderthal and modern human traits that are predicted by hybridization theory. So how would you identify a hybrid Neanderthal? Well, even if those traits persist into modern humans, it would be so well absorbed that it wouldn't be really very visible in today's modern humans. But the first offspring, or first or second or third generation offspring of these hybridized Neanderthal humans might appear something like we see from Abrigo Lagarvelo in Portugal from about 25,000 years ago, from the Upper Paleolithic period, and it has sort of a mosaic of different characteristics, some of which are Neanderthal and some of which are modern human. This is argued by some researchers that this is actually strong evidence for the hybridization as well. So it seems like the DNA supports this strong out of Africa but also hybridization model somewhere in between those. So it doesn't look like it could be that Neanderthals were already starting a decline in terms of their success, but when humans came in, they were able to breed with Neanderthals and absorb them into their population. This is also backed up by the artifactual evidence that we have, where there are some transitional tool industries that you see that some of the technology that the Neanderthals were using starts to be hybridized with some of the things that the humans are using when they come in. There's some examples of this of transitional tool industries that you can see in your book, and I also have a slide with some pictures of Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, and Magdalenian technologies, which sort of cover this transitional period where we're going from the Levallois technique of chipping off small flakes and using those into some other types of technologies that we see. So the Aurignacian, for instance, from about 40 to 26,000 years ago was dominated by bladelets, these little microliths, and bone tools not found in previous periods. And then the Gravettian, 26 to 23,000 years ago, small points, hunting points, but whole points, not little microliths. And the Solutrean, going back to some biface technology, these carved in the round through pressure flaking. So rather than percussion, they're actually very carefully putting pressure on the stone and flaking away things to make bifaces. And then the Magdalenian, from about 20 to about 10,000 years ago, has bone tools, harpoons, and also some other blade technologies, but larger blades. The Upper Paleolithic shows much more variation in stone tools, and this may be the fragmentation of human groups that are breaking up into different traditions. They're creating different communities, and they're meeting different challenges as they move into different areas as well. And also when they meet other groups, they can actually borrow and be influenced by those. It seems as though there's some evidence for things like sewing, so they must have had clothes or maybe tents. They had blades and bone tools, and they also traded raw materials over long distances. So there was probably either direct or down the line trade for sought out commodities, really good stone or really good important types of pigmentation or that sort of thing. And this, of course, gets into hypotheses about community formation, things that we can borrow from anthropology, cultural anthropology, to create models of how this would have happened. And also, by the Gravettian period, we have advances in technology that uses the imagination, like the atlatl, which is a sort of a lever device that you can throw spears with, which creates higher velocity and greater range for hunting. Also, you have an advance in the type and the complexity of artwork. We have an antler from La Marche, which has a very complex set of patterns, which may have been for sort of counting or thinking about ordering and structuring your world around you. Burials appear in the Gravettian with rich ornamentation, some of which have more than others. So you may actually have some kind of social inequality. That may sound unfair, but actually that's sort of the origin of more complex societies. Some people have advantages over others in that society. We're going to look a lot more carefully at those. So already by the end of this Paleolithic period, we're starting to see the potential for social inequality. So could be some that were hereditary, high status birth from Moravia, and young children in Sungir in Russia that could have actually been born into status or wealth. Also, we have in the Upper Paleolithic period, we have more transportable art, mobiliary art, like a lion-headed figure at Hohenstein and a female figure at Hohlefels. And in the Gravettian period, we have abstract, stylized, human-like figures, anthropomorphic figurines, like the so-called Venus figurines. There's many of these types, but the very famous Venus of Willendorf from Austria is amongst these. Also, we have probable musical instruments, but we don't know what the art that appears on tools and other sort of things, what their purpose was exactly. At this time, also from about a little bit earlier, from about 38,000 to 33,000 years ago, Chauvet Cave has cave art, paintings from Lascaux, the very famous Lascaux and Altamira caves, slightly later, from about 20 to 11,000 years ago. We have stylized abstract images of animals, and they're extremely well executed. Rarely depicting humans, but sometimes things like a handprint that you blow some pigment around it and it leaves your impression on it. What were these for? Was it for aesthetics? Probably not just. Was it for conceptions of magic or planning for a hunt or telling a story, seeking for abundance or fertility in the animals? Maybe it was for something more spiritual and something that we can't quite put our finger on, shamanistic rituals. They could have been telling the whole worldview of the way people saw the construction of the universe, their cosmology, and telling a story of their people to one another, or maybe bringing up children. Another important thing is that we see just the finished product, but we didn't see the construction. So how was it created is an important part of this. Were you telling a story while you were making the images? Did you overlay one image over another one that was done at an earlier time or by a different person? There are also some instances where the art can't really be even viewed. You actually have to crawl down, and you're like this far from where these paintings were made, and you're on your back. So whoever put it there, those paintings weren't intending for anybody else really to see it. You can't really stand back and look at it like in an art gallery. So we don't fully understand this. why it was done. But as I said before, this shows that humans are really starting to ramp up their use of their brain to imagine a world around them. Their community's part of that world and it exists in the physical world, but they're inventing a new reality for themselves. This is also backed up by things like body ornamentation. They've got pierced animal teeth, pierced shells, bone beads, necklaces, probably some of which were attached to clothing, and also textiles. They also were living in things constructed with bone substructures for tents and huts. They had tool-making areas, certain zones of the site that were for particular type of production activities. They seem to have shared meat through the evidence that we have from the storage and the animal bones that are left behind for on these sites. They were hunting herds of wild animals, but they may have been mobile, following herds. But some sites in the later periods especially may have actually been habitually returned to. So maybe people had a territory that they went around at different seasons, gathered plants, fished, understood the environment around them, and maybe weren't just traveling huge treks all the time. Not every group would have been doing that. So you get some aggregation. You get some larger sites building up, maybe some population increases. And of course, the final question I'll just leave you with, the final slide in this is why did this happen, and why, going back again to this question about Colin Renfrew's sapient paradox. Why did not very much happen for the first half of human existence, and then suddenly things start to ramp up, and then once the latter part, and for the past 40,000 years or so, it really starts skyrocketing, and we're going to actually look at how that even increases and accelerates. Was there something like a brain organization mutation? Was there something about our brains that it wasn't just the size, but the way we were using them? Did a mutation allow for a development of a more sophisticated development of communication and language? And did this mutation, if there was one, or a restructuring or reuse of the brain, did it create the capability for creation of symbolic artifacts? Those symbolic artifacts are going to be crucial for grounding human communities into an increasingly complex system as time goes on. So we'll come back to that in the next chapter. So thanks.